Disney has done it. They have sued Ron DeSantis and the state of Florida over the Reedy Creek issue. In a story that began more than a year ago when Disney spoke out against the Parental Rights and Education Act that was passed in the state of Florida. Disney spoke. The state of Florida didn't like that. They threatened to dissolve the Reedy Creek district, and the two have been basically at war ever since. A war that was perhaps always destined to wind up where we are today. Disney suing the state of Florida. We're going to try and quickly recap the events that got us here, what the lawsuit alleges, what Disney is suing for, and what we believe will be the most likely outcome. Reedy Creek, or what is known today as the Central Florida Tourism Oversight District, is an agreement that's been in place for more than 50 years. The agreement between Disney and the state of Florida was written to help develop the space that we now know as Walt Disney World. It gave Disney the ability to develop that land free from any interference from the state or from local government. No permits, no regulations, no oversight of any kind. They were free to do whatever they wanted, however they wanted. And obviously that's a very good arrangement for Disney. Any company would love to be able to act without any sort of oversight on what they're doing. But it has also been equally good for the state of Florida. The state probably would not have been able to develop that land. They were looking for somebody to develop that land for them because they could not. That is why they created the Reedy Creek District, so that Disney could come in and develop that space. And eventually, with Disney's help, they helped turn the state of Florida into one of the biggest tourism locations in the world. And all of that is due in large part to Reedy Creek. And it all became threatened after the fight began between Disney and Ron DeSantis over the Parental Rights and Education Act. The state threatened, in retaliation to Disney's comments, to void Reedy Creek. Now, that didn't quite work out as DeSantis had initially hoped. They wanted to dissolve the district, but they apparently were unable to. Instead, they created a new set of guidelines that sort of tightened the watch over Disney a little bit and gave it a new name. It is now called the Central Florida Tourism and Oversight District. And Disney stayed relatively silent over this. We didn't really hear much from them after this, initial draft bill was announced. They said only that the Disney company and Reedy Creek had a great history together. They did a lot of great things, and they're hoping that they continue to do more great things with this new agreement. It was, though, at this point that most thought this is the time now. Disney should be suing at this point. They were surprised that they didn't sue, in fact. And this is mostly on the grounds that the new agreement had violated Disney's rights as property owners. The voters in the RCID, the board members, were supposed to be elected citizens, elected property owners within the district. The new board, however, were essentially handpicked by the governor, Ron DeSantis, and none of them were property owners. None of them had a vested interest in how the place was run. And again, many argue that this is the point where Disney should have sued. They did not. Instead, they drafted some new agreements. While the RCID was still in effect before the new board or the new district took over, new agreements that would appear to extend the district's rights to act as they had been in the past 50 years for another 30 years going forward, no matter what the new district did, no matter what DeSantis' new board did. The new agreements were now the law of the land. And that set the Florida governor off in a flurry of statements and actions that led us to the point where we are today. Since February, since Disney made that move, DeSantis has threatened to levy new taxes on Disney hotels. He's threatened to create new tolls on roads within the district, that is, tolls inside of Walt Disney World property. He threatened to develop some of the property that the district owns with more amusement parks. Not more Disney amusement parks, mind you, but the competition. He even threatened to build a new state prison on district property. And of course, he also threatened to dissolve the agreement completely. He didn't do it that first time. And many reasons this was because of the bond debt that the Disney company was paying. Bond debt that, if the district were resolved, would have to be paid by whomever takes over the district. Disney's out, okay, somebody else is in. That person, that entity, now has to pay that bond debt. That entity would have been the state or the local city or county governments. But apparently that was not a consideration on Wednesday, because the current board voted to declare on Wednesday that the agreement between the state of Florida and the Walt Disney Company was void. Neither Reedy Creek or the new Central Florida Tourism Oversight District were a thing. And immediately following this, Disney filed their lawsuit. And that's about as succinctly as I can put things as we are today. Now, it's worth noting that the state's move to void the contract and Disney's subsequent lawsuit, both of those things happened on the same day. And that suit is detailed in a 77-page memo that I have linked below if you care to read it, one that I have read from top to bottom. And this tells me one very important thing. Disney was more than ready for this action by the state. They were expecting it. How else could they have a 77-page memo ready to go, ready to hit the printer and click send on that email as soon as the vote was taken? They've been waiting for this. And it reconciles with a point made in our last video about Reedy Creek when discussing Disney's last-hour development agreement that appeared to upset DeSantis' plans for Disney. We believe then that Disney wanted the state to do this in order to give them the opportunity to file this lawsuit. In so doing, while the lawsuit is pending, Disney would be able to keep operating business as usual while everything gets held up in court. The district would remain in full effect until a judgment was made. And this legal process could last for years, long enough possibly to outlast the governor, either by virtue of him running for president, which is a very clear possibility. That is something that people are talking about, or just otherwise beyond his term of office. Florida governors can run for just a maximum of 2 terms. He's already run 1 term, just got reelected in 2022. His term would be set to end in 2027. Now, that's a long time from now, of course. That's another 4 years still, but perhaps Disney has a plan to endure 4 more years of this in court. Otherwise, they're going to try to win this using the Constitution. The suit is citing 5 causes of action. The first, a violation of the contract clause of the Constitution. This clause states that no state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts. In other words, it prohibits local government entities from abrogating or repealing their own contracts with private entities, such as Disney. I will note here that contract law is very, very important, especially for businesses that are operating in the size and scope of the Disney company. And it's even more important, it's even more fundamental to contracts between a private entity, a business like Disney, and a government. Disney is aware of this and cites Florida's own Supreme Court precedent where they state that contract law is, and this is a quote, one of the most sacrosanct rights guaranteed by our fundamental law. Put simply, the state can't just summarily void a contract without cause. Now, I'm sure the state will say that they did have just cause when Disney entered into those agreements, those last-minute agreements back in February with themselves. What is termed as self-dealing is something that we're going to get back to in a minute. But let's talk about the second violation. Per Disney, they have violated the takings clause of the Constitution. This clause states that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. Disney is stating that their rights as property owners, which are dealt with in the same way, are being taken without payment or compensation. Third is a violation of Disney's constitutional right to due process, and that pretty much speaks for itself. Florida just decided that they're going to avoid that deal. And this likely will be the clause that puts a stay on the government's attempts to avoid the deal. It's going to put everything on pause. Also that Disney can have, their day in court, as it were. And that's backed up in this memo, this 77-page memo. They argue in that throughout that memo that the state's actions are nothing more than retaliation against the Disney company for voicing their protected speech. Their constitutional right to free speech, which again, we're going to get to that also in a second. And they probably won't have a difficult time proving that because DeSantis has been quite overt, quite plain. He is more or less just admitting that that's exactly what they've been doing. DeSantis has said that Disney crossed the line, that they shouldn't get involved, and that it's not going to work out well for them. And this is a good one. This is something that he stated in his book, that the legislature agreed to take it up, and that would have been unthinkable just a few months before. But Disney had clearly crossed a line in its support of indoctrinating very young school children in woke gender identity politics. And what Disney, and including this in the argument, what Disney is doing there is showing that they have made a connection between Disney's political speech, their comments, and they're making a correlation to legislation. They're connecting those two things, which is forbidden. Disney is protected. They have a right to say what they want. The state can't take those words and then use it against them in legislation. Per Randy Fine, he's the author of the bill. He said that you kick the hornet's nest, things come up. And I will say, this is a quote, I will say this, you got me on one thing, this bill does target one company, it targets the Walt Disney Company. Now there's lots more, and most of it is from DeSantis directly. However, it could be said that while much of what he's saying is incendiary and combative, it doesn't quite rise to the level of a constitutional violation. And it's actually in the same way that some of his threats are kind of toothless also. For example, it's doubtful that they would be able to impose new taxes on hotels or levy new tolls on the roads or to build a state prison on district property. These are all things, as far as I understand, to my understanding, these are all things that people need to vote on and agree to. Getting a prison built in the middle of a resort, a vacation district, I mean, that's darn near next to impossible. You're not going to get a single vote, be that from the right or the left, from red or blue. You're not going to get a single vote to say, yes, I'm putting a prison right there in the middle of that district, anywhere, not even in the metro areas of that city. Anyway, moving on, the last two causes for action are related to Disney's First Amendment. They're saying that the actions violate Disney's First Amendment right to free speech. And on this, I think I'll just let Disney's words speak for themselves. Per Disney, Disney's public statements on House Bill 1557 are fully protected by the First Amendment, which applies with particular force to political speech. Speech such as Disney's on public issues and petitions to the government occupy the core of the protection afforded by the First Amendment. First Amendment protects speech intended to influence public opinion and, in turn, any proposed legislation. What they're saying is that the First Amendment obviously is a thing, but it's even more a thing for things that are exactly like what Disney is saying. People should be free to speak out against their government. Whether you're an individual or a business, you should be able to speak out against the government and any sort of policy or legislation that you don't agree with. You're free to speak. And this seems to be a very clear point in Disney's favor. They should be able to speak out against legislation, be that in California or Florida, which is a point that DeSantis tried to make, is that Disney's a California company. But I mean, they have a significant operation in the state of Florida and have a vested interest in what happens there. But having said that, I believe that the state's opposition to that argument would be that, sure, Disney is free to speak about legislation and voice their opinion, and DeSantis might not agree with that as well. He might be upset that they spoke. It's that Disney followed that statement up by saying, not only do we not agree with this legislation, but we're going to use the full power and force of the Disney company to try to change this law. We're going to do something about it. And that's really where the state's defenses kicked in. So, okay, so what happens now? What does Disney want to accomplish with this lawsuit? Well, I think it's very clear. They're basing it on constitutional violations, suggests that they just want things to return to how they were, to protect their future plans and to protect their business relationships that are needed with third parties in order to continue operating their business and to continue their 30 years of progress, to continue spending $17 billion on the development of the property and creating more jobs and all that. It's necessary for them to have a strong foundation, contractual foundation, in order to do that. They need that district in place. So Disney is asking for the court to declare that the legislative declaration is unlawful and unenforceable, to declare that the previous contracts remain in effect and enforceable. To put it more plainly, as I just said, they just want things back the way they were. The way they were a couple years ago, the way they have been for the last 50 years. How will that turn out for them? Well, I've heard a lot of interesting arguments from both sides of the conversation. Disney has some very clear advantages with regard to contract law and their rights to free speech, First Amendment. But I also think it's pretty clear that to most people who are viewing this, at least kind of closely, that Disney is self-dealing. I don't think anybody would doubt that Reedy Creek equals Disney. The two are the same. But on this point, I'm not sure how much of that is going to factor in a court decision. For example, Disney being a self-governing entity, that's not something that they've been doing, nefariously in the dark. They didn't just kind of conjure this plan up and have been working in secret. behind, closed doors. It's an agreement that Disney came to with the state of Florida. The state of Florida said, here, have this. And Disney said, okay, thank you very much. We're going to develop Walt Disney World now for you. They came by that agreement, honestly, and it has been theirs for the past 50 years. And they have a right to expect to continue that. Whether or not they agreed with Ron DeSantis, like that shouldn't even be entered into the conversation per Disney. So there's arguments to be made on both sides about that. And the state would have you think that Disney's been using this to take advantage of the tax-paying citizens and of the state and of other businesses. But, I mean, that's not really true, is it? Disney pays plenty in taxes. I think the last number I heard was $1 billion they paid in taxes last year. They try to make it sound like Disney's getting away with shoddy, craftsmanship or shoddy, safety precautions and things like that in the park. They want to do monorail inspections to make sure that's all shipshape. I think everybody agrees. I'm not talking about you and me, but experts agree that Disney's levels, Disney's standards are above those of the state. If the state tried to impose, their health and safety standards on the Disney company, Disney would say that's not good enough. We're better than that. And what's even more interesting is that I want to say that none of that matters. That I want to say that this will never see the inside of a courtroom. They'll never get to the point where they argue the merits of those types of conversations. That, at some point, Disney and DeSantis and the state of Florida are going to come to some kind of compromise. That's what I said when this first started. I said, it's never going to get to that point. It's never going to get to June of 2023, which is fast approaching, by the way. It's never going to get to that point that they will figure things out and everybody will be happy. That's what I said more than a year ago. But that's when I didn't really fully understand Ron DeSantis. I underestimated DeSantis's tenacity and his willingness to fight. Whether it's correct or not, whether he's right, correct to fight, or he's out of line, that's a separate conversation. He's willing. He wants to fight. He's got the pit bull mentality on this, and he's going to fight. Even if it costs him his political career, I think he would keep doing it. I too. The rest of the GOP, for example, they would probably counsel him to back down, to find some sort of compromise, to settle. But today, I really don't see him as being the settling type. I think this could see the inside of a courtroom. I think this could go the distance. And I guess if you were to ask me to pick a winner, if it does get to that point, I do feel like, it's not a slam dunk either way. It's not 100 or 0. There's lots of gray areas here. But I think overall, I think Disney does have the advantage. I think the contract law stuff works in their favor, as I mentioned, and the freedom of speech issues, the 1A stuff, works in their favor. And I would also say that Disney's pretty good at this courtroom stuff. There's a lot of things that Disney's not good at these days. They can be dysfunctional at times. They perhaps have forgotten how to properly theme a hotel. But one thing that they are good at is winning in court. What's happening with that Magic Key lawsuit anyway? Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed. Be safe out there. Be kind to one another. Fresh baked.